The response did not come back immediately, and that alone was wrong, because systems like this were built for speed, for instant confirmation or denial. But instead there was a pause, a stretch of dead air that felt longer than it should have been, and Sergeant Daniel Brooks heard it clearly through the faint static of his radio. That subtle shift when someone on the other end stops what they are doing. And in that silence his grip tightened just slightly, his instincts locking in place. Because he had heard that kind of pause before, not in routine calls, not in simple checks, but in moments when a name carried weight beyond its surface. And as the seconds passed, the training yard remained frozen, Ethan Cole still holding his position, still trying to maintain control over something that was quietly slipping beyond his understanding. Because the longer Thomas Hale stood there without reacting, the more the situation stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like a mistake. And that realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and persistent. While the other cadets shifted their weight, their earlier confidence thinning into something less certain, their eyes flicking between Ethan and the old man as if waiting for a signal that never came. And Hale remained unchanged, his breathing steady, his posture unmoved, as if time itself had slowed around him. And then the radio crackled, sharp enough to cut through the tension, and Brooks lifted it closer, his voice already prepared. But he did not need to speak again, because the voice on the other end came through first, controlled but unmistakably altered, stripped of casual tone and replaced with something precise, something careful, repeating the name back to him in full. Thomas Hale. Each syllable measured, as if confirming not just identity, but significance. And Brooks answered once, firm and clear, his eyes never leaving the man at the center of the yard. And for a brief moment, there was another silence, shorter this time, but heavier, followed by a single response that changed everything. Stand by, delivered without explanation, without delay. And then the line went quiet, not disconnected but redirected, moving upward through channels that did not activate for routine matters. And Brooks exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in confirmation, because he knew exactly what that meant, even if the cadets around him did not. And across the yard Ethan felt the shift without understanding it, felt the invisible change in atmosphere as if pressure had dropped around him, and his focus wavered again, just for a fraction of a second. Enough to notice the way Hale's gaze had not changed at all, still calm, still steady, still watching. And that was when doubt became something real, something he could not push aside, because men who had nothing to lose did not stand like that. And men who had already faced worse did not react the way he expected. And somewhere beyond the horizon of the base, vehicles were already moving, orders being given without hesitation, a chain of command reacting not to a situation, but to a name. And back on the training yard the wind shifted once more, carrying with it a faint, distant sound that none of the cadets recognized yet. But Brooks did, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. Because whatever was coming next was not part of the exercise, and it was going to arrive sooner than any of them were ready for. The sound reached them before the realization did. A low, distant hum that rolled across the training yard like approaching thunder, subtle at first, but unmistakable once heard. And Sergeant Daniel Brooks tilted his head slightly, confirming what his instincts had already told him, because that was not background noise, that was movement, coordinated and deliberate, and it was coming fast. While the cadets remained locked in place, unaware that the situation had already moved beyond them, their focus still trapped in the narrow space between authority and assumption. And Ethan Cole felt it again, that pressure shifting, that invisible line he could no longer define, because nothing about the old man had changed, and yet everything around him had. The air heavier, the silence sharper, the ground itself seeming to wait. And Thomas Hale stood exactly as he had from the beginning. Unmoved, unshaken, his presence now filling the space in a way that made the weapon pointed at him feel smaller, irrelevant, as if it belonged to a different reality entirely. And one of the cadets, standing just off to the side, found his attention pulled back to that faint mark on Hale's sleeve, the worn edges, the way the fabric had faded unevenly around it. And without thinking he leaned closer, curiosity overriding discipline for a single moment. His fingers brushing lightly across the surface as if trying to make sense of something that refused to be clear. And that was when it hit him, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a shift so sudden it stole the air from his lungs, because in that instant the training yard dissolved, replaced by something colder, heavier, the sound of distant rotors cutting through thick air, the weight of silence before action, the kind that settles just before everything changes, and he saw flashes, not complete images but fragments. A figure moving through uncertainty with absolute precision, a voice calm over a channel filled with tension, a call sign spoken once and never questioned. And then just as quickly as it came, it was gone, snapping him back to the present where his hand still rested against the old fabric, and he pulled it away immediately, his expression shifting, confusion mixing with something deeper, something closer to realization, while across from him Ethan noticed the change, the hesitation spreading, and for the first time the formation around him felt unstable, like something carefully built beginning to lean under its own weight, and he tightened his stance, trying to anchor himself in training, in protocol, in anything that still made sense. But the hum in the distance grew louder now, no longer something that could be ignored, and Brooks lowered his radio slowly, his decision already made, his role shifting from observer to witness, because whatever was about to arrive was not meant for intervention. It was meant to be seen, and as the wind carried that sound across the yard, Thomas Hale finally moved, not in reaction, not in defense, but in the smallest possible way, a slight adjustment of his stance, a quiet shift of weight that spoke not of tension but of readiness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is about to happen before anyone else does. And in that moment, without a word spoken, the balance of power completed its turn. The sound grew from a distant hum into something unmistakable, a steady rhythm that carried authority long before anything came into view, and every cadet felt it now, not as noise but as presence, something approaching with purpose, something that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood by those who knew what to listen for. And Sergeant Daniel Brooks did not move, his posture straight but relaxed, his eyes fixed on Thomas Hale, as if the rest of the world had already become secondary. Because in that moment the training yard was no longer a place of instruction, it was a place of revelation, and the cadets standing there, rigid in their formation, began to feel the shift without knowing how to name it. The quiet certainty that whatever was coming was not for them, was not about them, and Ethan Cole felt it most of all. The weight of something larger pressing down on the situation he thought he controlled, his grip tightening again not out of confidence, but out of instinct, because control was slipping and he could not see where it was going. While Hale remained exactly as he had been, calm and grounded, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if the approaching sound was not a disruption but an expected arrival. And that realization began to settle into the edges of Ethan's mind, uncomfortable and undeniable, because men do not wait like that unless they know who is coming, and they do not stand like that unless they have nothing to prove. And the hum sharpened into distinct motion now, the distant outline of vehicles appearing beyond the edge of the training grounds, moving fast but controlled, dust trailing behind them in long sweeping arcs that caught the sunlight. And the formation of cadets faltered almost imperceptibly, shoulders tightening, heads turning, attention breaking from the single point it had been locked on, because the world outside their drill was intruding in a way that could not be ignored. And Brooks exhaled slowly, not in relief but in confirmation, because this was no longer speculation, it was reality unfolding exactly as he expected, and he lowered his radio completely, his role finished, because whatever came next did not require his voice, only his presence, and one of the cadets near the edge took a step back without realizing it, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. And Ethan noticed that movement, the fracture spreading through his line, and for the first time doubt rose fully into awareness, no longer a flicker but a steady pressure, because the equation had changed and he could not see how. While Hale made no move to acknowledge any of it, his focus still fixed, his stillness now carrying a different weight, not just calm but certainty. And as the vehicles drew closer, slowing with precision rather than urgency, the final piece settled into place, not spoken but understood, that this moment had never belonged to the cadets, that it had always been something else entirely, something waiting for the right time to reveal itself. And now that time had arrived, the vehicles did not rush in. They arrived with control, tires rolling to a precise stop along the edge of the training yard, as if every inch had been measured before they even moved, and the engines idled low, steady, carrying that same quiet authority that had filled the air moments earlier, and no one spoke. Not the cadets, not the observers, because something about the way those doors opened demanded silence, one after another, deliberate, unhurried, and Sergeant Daniel Brooks straightened slightly, not out of tension but out of recognition, because he knew what this kind of arrival meant. It was not chaos, it was command, and from the lead vehicle stepped a man whose presence alone shifted the weight of the entire field, his uniform sharp, his posture exact, his eyes already scanning before his boots fully met the ground. And he did not look at the cadets. First, he did not look at the formation or the disrupted drill. His attention moved past all of that, as if it were background noise, because he was not here for them. And that realization spread like a current through the line, subtle but immediate. While Ethan Cole felt it hit him harder than anything else so far, because the moment that man stepped forward, the illusion of control shattered completely, not through force, not through command, but through presence alone, and Ethan's grip faltered just enough for him to notice it, just enough for doubt to settle in fully, because this was no longer a scenario he understood, and across from him Thomas Hale remained exactly where he had been, his stance unchanged, his gaze steady, as if this arrival was not unexpected, as if it had always been part of the outcome. And the officer continued forward, his steps measured, his focus narrowing until it locked onto Hale with absolute clarity. And in that instant the distance between them seemed to carry more meaning than anything that had happened before, because every cadet watching could feel it, even if they could not explain it, that this was not a meeting of rank and civilian. This was something else, something deeper, and Sergeant Brooks lowered his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in submission but in acknowledgement, because he understood now that this moment did not belong to protocol. It belonged to history, and the officer stopped just short of Hale, the space between them quiet and heavy, and for a breath everything held still, the wind, the sound, the tension, until in one smooth motion the officer brought his hand up in a crisp, deliberate salute, not rushed, not hesitant, but exact, and the effect was immediate, because in that single gesture the entire situation inverted, everything the cadets thought they understood about authority, about control, about who held power in that moment, collapsed without a word being spoken, and Ethan felt it completely, the realization settling in with a clarity that left no room for denial, because the man he had been holding at gunpoint was not what he had assumed, not even close, and the silence that followed was no longer tension, it was understanding. No one moved to correct the salute, no one spoke to break it, because the moment did not need explanation, it carried its own weight, and Thomas Hale did not return it immediately, not out of hesitation, not out of disrespect, but because time seemed to stretch in that space between them, the kind of pause that only happens when something long buried finally surfaces, and when he did lift his hand it was slow, deliberate, the motion of someone who had performed it 1,000 times before but no longer needed to prove its meaning, and the two stood there in perfect stillness, one offering respect, the other accepting it without demand, and every cadet watching felt it, the shift from confusion into something heavier, something closer to realization, because this was not about rank on paper or authority in a chain of command. This was something earned, something carried through years no one in that formation had lived yet, and Ethan Cole felt it most of all, the full weight of his mistakes settling in, not as fear, not as panic, but as clarity, because the man in front of him had never been under his control, not for a single second, and the object in his hands now felt different, not powerful, not defining, just misplaced in a moment that no longer belonged to him. And slowly, almost without thinking, he lowered it, the motion careful, controlled, as if trying to restore balance to something already broken, and no one gave the order, no voice commanded it. But the rest of the cadets followed, their posture adjusting, their stance shifting from rigid assertion to quiet attention, because something deeper than instruction had taken over, something instinctive, and Sergeant Daniel Brooks watched it all unfold without interference, his role complete, because this was the lesson no training scenario could replicate, the moment when understanding replaces assumption, and the officer who had arrived took a single step closer to Hale, his voice finally breaking the silence, low and precise, not for the crowd, but for the man in front of him, acknowledging him in a way that did not need titles or explanation. And though the cadets could not hear every word, they did not need to, because the tone alone carried enough meaning, and Hale responded with nothing more than a slight nod, the smallest gesture, but one that seemed to carry years within it. And the wind moved again across the yard, lighter now, no longer carrying tension, but something closer to release. And as the moment settled into memory, every cadet standing there understood that what had just happened would stay with them far longer than any drill, far longer than any instruction, because they had witnessed something rare, something unspoken, the kind of truth that does not need to be explained to be understood. And in that quiet, with no commands given and no voices raised, respect took its place where assumption had once stood. The yard did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, as if the ground itself remembered what had just happened. And the officer slowly lowered his salute, but did not step away, his attention still fixed on Thomas Hale with a level of focus that ignored everything else. And for the cadets standing in formation, that was the moment it truly sank in, because nothing about this interaction was routine. Nothing about it followed the structure they had been taught, and yet it carried more authority than any command they had ever heard. And Ethan Cole stood frozen in place, his arms now lowered, his posture no longer rigid with control, but still, almost careful, as if any sudden movement might break something he did not fully understand. And his mind replayed the last few minutes in fragments, each one now different, each one sharper, because what he had thought was certainty had been replaced with something far more difficult to ignore. And across from him Hale shifted slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to signal that the moment had passed for him, that whatever needed to be acknowledged already had been. And the officer nodded once in return, a small motion that carried more meaning than any speech could have. And then he turned, not to leave, but to face the line of cadets, his gaze moving across them with precision, stopping just long enough on each face to ensure the message was understood without a single word spoken. And when his eyes reached Ethan, they held there for a fraction longer, not in anger, not in reprimand, but in something far more exacting, a quiet expectation that required no explanation. And Ethan felt it fully, the weight of it settling into his posture, forcing his shoulders back into alignment, his focus forward, his breathing steady, not because he was ordered to, but because anything less would feel out of place in that moment. And Sergeant Daniel Brooks watched from the side, his expression unchanged but his attention sharp, because this was the final phase, the part where the lesson moved from experience into understanding, and no one spoke to guide it. No one needed to, because the silence itself carried everything that needed to be said. And one by one the cadets adjusted, their stance shifting into something cleaner, something more grounded, not out of fear but out of recognition. And the officer gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming that the moment had reached its conclusion. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, he stepped back toward the vehicles, his role complete, his presence no longer required. And as he moved away, the air seemed to release with him, the tension fading not into relief but into something quieter, something lasting. And Thomas Hale remained for a second longer, his gaze sweeping once across the yard, not lingering, not judging, just observing, before he turned as well, his steps unhurried, his posture unchanged. And no one moved to stop him, no one thought to, because whatever had needed to happen already had. And as he walked away, the cadets stood in silence, not waiting for orders, not looking for instruction, but holding on to the understanding that had settled into them, something that would not fade when the moment ended, something that would stay long after the yard returned to routine. The engines faded into the distance, and the training yard slowly returned to its usual shape, but nothing felt the same, not to the cadets standing in formation, not to Ethan Cole, and not even to Sergeant Daniel Brooks, because what had just happened did not belong to routine. It belonged to memory, the kind that settles deep and does not leave. And for a long moment no one spoke, no one moved to reset the drill or call the next command, because there was nothing left to rehearse, nothing left to correct. The lesson had already been delivered in a way no instruction ever could. And Ethan stood there with his shoulders squared, but his perspective altered, his mind no longer replaying what he had done, but understanding what he had failed to see. Because the man he had faced had never needed to prove anything, never needed to react, never needed to assert control, and that realization carried more weight than any reprimand could have. And slowly, without being told, Ethan adjusted his stance, not into the rigid posture of a cadet under inspection, but into something steadier, something grounded, as if he were aligning himself with a standard he had only just recognized. And around him the others did the same, their movements quiet, their focus sharpened, not by command but by understanding. And Brooks watched it unfold with a faint nod, not of approval but of acknowledgement, because this was what mattered, not the mistake, but the correction that followed, the shift from assumption to awareness. And as the wind moved across the yard again, lighter now, carrying only the distant sounds of a bass returning to life, the space where Thomas Hale had stood seemed unchanged and yet completely different, as if it held the imprint of something larger than a single moment. And no one spoke his name, no one needed to, because the silence carried it well enough. And as the cadets finally reset, their formation, their movements precise and deliberate, there was a new weight behind it. Not pressure, not fear, but respect, the kind that does not come from rules but from experience. And Ethan's gaze lingered for just a second longer on the path where Hale had walked away, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, before returning forward, his focus clearer than it had been before. And somewhere beyond the visible edges of the base, life continued as it always did. But for those who had stood on that yard, something had shifted permanently, something quiet but unshakable, because they had seen what happens when presence outweighs power, when silence speaks louder than command, and when a man does not need to prove who he is, because he has already lived it. And the lesson remained long after the moment passed, steady and certain, like a truth that does not need to be repeated to be remembered.